In 1881, 25 Americans sailed into the high Arctic believing they were part of a carefully planned scientific mission. They carried years of supplies, orders from Washington, and the confidence that help would always return for them. But in the far north, plans mean nothing. The ice closes, ships turn back, promises are buried beneath frozen seas. Within 3 years, this expedition, once hailed as a triumph of science and national pride, would become one of the most horrifying survival stories in American history. Not because of storms, not because of the cold, but because they were left behind. In the late 19th century, the world was still a place of uncharted territories, and none loomed larger in the imagination than the Arctic, a frozen, mysterious realm that promised scientific discovery and national glory. This is the story of one such quest, an American mission known as the Lady Franklin Bay Expedition. It was a bold venture into the heart of the ice, meant to last just 2 years. But what began as a scientific triumph would descend into a desperate struggle for survival, a harrowing tale of human endurance against the most brutal forces of nature. The year was 1881. The United States, eager to make its mark during the first International Polar Year, launched its own expedition. The goal was to establish a research station farther north than ever before, collecting vital data on weather and magnetism. But there was another ambition: to beat the British and claim the coveted title of farthest north. Leading this daring mission was First Lieutenant Adolphus Greely. He was a Civil War veteran, a man known for his strict discipline. Yet, for all his military experience, he knew nothing of the Arctic. He was a meteorologist, skilled in weather systems, but the frozen wilderness was a different beast entirely. His crew was a mix of 25 souls, military men, a physician, and 2 invaluable Inuit dog sled drivers. In July of 1881, their steamship, the Proteus, pushed north into the unknown. They reached Lady Franklin Bay, a remote icy inlet on the coast of Ellesmere Island that would become their home. With 350 tons of supplies, enough, they believed, for 3 years, the men built a sturdy outpost they proudly named Fort Conger. At the time, it was the northernmost permanent settlement in the world. The expedition was an immediate success. Days were filled with scientific observation. Exploration parties mapped unknown coastlines, and in May of 1882 they achieved their goal. A team pushed further north than any human before, establishing a new farthest north record for America. Greely proudly declared that for the first time in 3 centuries, England yields the honor. The mission, it seemed, was a triumph. As autumn bled into winter, the sun vanished, plunging Fort Conger into 137 days of continuous darkness. Temperatures dropped to an average of -24 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the relative warmth of their fort, the men endured their first Arctic winter. Restlessness began to simmer beneath the surface. But their plan was clear. A relief ship was scheduled to arrive in the summer of 1882 with fresh supplies and mail from home. As the long night finally ended, the men scanned the horizon, their hopes high. But the summer of 1882 came and went. No ship appeared. Unbeknownst to Greely and his men, the relief vessel, the Neptune, had been dispatched. But the Arctic ice, unusually dense and unbroken, had proven impassable. The ship was forced to turn back, its hold still full of the food and letters meant for Fort Conger. The men at the outpost would receive no news of this failure. They were isolated, completely cut off from the world. They adjusted their rations slightly, assuming the delay was a minor setback. They would simply have to endure another winter. But as the days shortened once more, a grim reality began to settle in. The Arctic, which had welcomed them with scientific wonders, was now tightening its icy grip. The promise of rescue had become a question mark. Their first year had passed. Their first relief ship had failed. And the true test of their survival was only just beginning. The summer of 1883 brought renewed hope to the men at Fort Conger. A second year had passed, and surely, this time, a relief ship would arrive. What they didn't know was that a second disaster was unfolding. The relief ship Proteus, the very vessel that had brought them north, was fighting the same impassable ice that had defeated the Neptune the year before. But this time, the ice didn't just stop the ship. It crushed it. The Proteus sank, taking most of the expedition's desperately needed supplies with it. A second relief ship, the Yantic, turned back, unable to proceed alone. The men were on their own. Lieutenant Greely now faced an impossible choice. His orders were clear. If rescue failed by the second summer, he was to abandon Fort Conger and retreat 250 miles south to Cape Sabine, where the relief ships were supposed to have left caches of supplies. Staying put meant certain starvation. Leaving meant a perilous journey in small, open boats through a sea of shifting ice. On August 9, 1883, they left their sturdy fort behind, casting their fate to the treacherous waters. The journey was a nightmare. For 51 grueling days, they dragged their boats over ice floes and rowed through freezing channels, their bodies weakening with every passing mile. They finally reached Cape Sabine in October, just as the long Arctic winter was closing in. Exhausted and near frozen, they searched for the promised supplies. What they found was a death sentence. Instead of a year's worth of food, there was barely enough for 40 days. The sinking of the Proteus had been a catastrophe they couldn't have imagined. Stranded, with the sea freezing behind them and a barren wasteland ahead, they built a miserable stone hut, covering it with their boat and a sail. They called it Camp Clay. It would become their tomb. The darkness returned, and with it, a cold more profound than any they had yet known. Rations were cut to just a few ounces a day. They boiled sealskin from their boots for a thin, greasy broth. They dug under the snow for lichens and hunted for tiny shrimp in the freezing water, often catching only a thimbleful after hours of work. The first man died in January, then another and another. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Scurvy loosened their teeth. The group's physician was suspected of hoarding medicine and food. Paranoia and despair festered in the darkness. By spring, the camp was a house of horrors. The survivors were too weak to bury their dead, leaving the bodies just outside their shelter. The living, driven by an unspeakable hunger, began secretly carving flesh from the frozen corpses of their fallen comrades. It was a grim, necessary secret to stay alive. The final breakdown of order came when one man, Private Henry, was repeatedly caught stealing the group's scant rations. Greely, seeing it as a threat to everyone's survival, gave the order. Henry was executed by firing squad. By June, only 7 men were left, barely clinging to life. By June of 1884, Camp Clay was no longer a camp. It was a grave. Of the 25 men who had sailed north with such confidence, only 7 remained. They were skeletons huddled together in a collapsed tent slick with ice and decay. The execution of Private Henry had ended the theft of rations, but it hadn't stopped the dying. The survivors were too weak to move the bodies of their comrades, which lay just outside, half buried in the snow. Hope was a forgotten language. Every gust of wind sounded like a final judgment. They were alone, at the end of the world, waiting for an end that had already begun. But they were not forgotten. Back in the United States, 2 failed rescue attempts had ignited a firestorm of public outrage. Newspapers ran headlines demanding action. The wife of Lieutenant Greely, Henrietta, relentlessly lobbied Congress, refusing to let her husband's expedition be written off as a loss. The pressure worked. The government authorized a third massive rescue effort, this time under the command of the U.S. Navy. 2 ships, the Thetis and the Bear, were reinforced to battle the Arctic ice. Their commander, Winfield Scott Schley, was given a single, stark order: find Greely's party, dead or alive. In the spring of 1884, they steamed north, racing against the brief Arctic summer and the certainty that they were already too late. On June 22nd, after a brutal fight through the ice fields, the rescue ships reached Cape Sabine. A search party went ashore. The landscape was desolate, silent. Then a lieutenant spotted something unnatural against the rocks, the remains of a tent nearly flattened by the wind. As they got closer, they saw a human figure staggering towards them. He fell. They ran to him. It was Sergeant Joseph Ellison, his hands and feet gone from frostbite, his eyes wild with delirium. He tried to speak, pointing back towards the tent. The rescuers braced themselves and approached the flapping canvas. The stench hit them first. Inside, they found a scene from a nightmare. 3 men, barely recognizable as human, lay in the filth of their sleeping bags. One was trying to spoon from an empty can. Another was dead, his companion too weak to notice. And there, propped up against a bag of supplies, was a man with a long beard, hollow eyes, and the tattered remains of a uniform. He was reading from a prayer book to another man who was clearly taking his last breaths. A rescuer softly asked, "Is that you, Greely?" The figure looked up, his eyes struggling to focus. He saluted weakly. "Yes," he whispered. 7 of us left. He had kept the expedition's scientific records and his diary safe, even as his men starved around him. His first act of survival had been to preserve their story. The rescue had come at the final possible moment. One of the survivors, Sergeant Ellison, died on the journey home. In the end, only 6 of the original 25 men made it back to America. They returned not to simple celebration, but to controversy when the details of their survival and the cannibalism became public. Their farthest north record had been secured, a tiny flag planted on a map. But its true cost was measured in 19 lives, a testament to the brutal indifference of the Arctic and the terrible price of being left behind. If you enjoyed this survival story, check out our other videos for other true survival stories and subscribe for more.